Welcome back to Church State Council today. My name is Steve Allred, and with me is Alan Reinach, and we are both with the Church State Council, which is the Pacific Union Conference's religious liberty ministry. And Alan, we get to talk about a recent or a Supreme Court case really today. I think what we want to start off talking about. Yesterday, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in a case that was challenging an executive order, one of President Trump's earliest executive orders that he signed on January 20 of 2026 with
25.
The goal, 25. Yeah.
Right after his inauguration.
Right after. Okay. Yes. Right. And the goal of this executive order was to end birthright citizenship for children born in the United States to parents without permanent immigration status. So that's the case, and we want to talk about it a little bit. So, but first off, Alan, why should we, as followers of Jesus, people of faith here on this podcast where we're talking about things that affect us, why should we care about this issue beyond maybe some of the humanitarian, human rights type of reasons? What are some scriptural, spiritual reasons that you think this matters?
Sometimes life has a way. We as believers, we think it's providential, maybe it's just coincidental, but there's some ironies sometimes that are just unmistakable. And the irony that really jumped out at me here, Steve, is that the Supreme Court is debating the rights of the children of immigrants, of strangers, on Erev Pesach, on the day that is the evening of the first day of Passover. And why do I say that? Because Passover is an extremely profound foundation of all of biblical ethics, not just Judaism, but Christianity. So, for example, one of the big church state issues of the day has to do with posting of the Ten Commandments in public school, right? There's two versions of the Ten Commandments in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. In Exodus, it says, I'm the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Therefore, and then recites the commandments. Because you are a people that God has rescued from slavery in Egypt. Okay. In Deuteronomy 5, the Sabbath commandment, references, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath. So for us as Adventists, for Christians generally, for Jews, the command to remember, that we were ourselves slaves, and the whole emphasis on in the retelling of the Exodus story in the Passover Seder is not, this is something God did for those people back there, so long ago. This is what God has done for us, And it's the wicked child in the kind of the parable of the four children as part of the retelling of the Passover during the Seder service. There's the wise child and the foolish child. The wicked child is the one who says what the Lord did for you, excluding himself. Okay. Now, let me connect this with, first off, with a key teaching in the New Testament. Because in Ephesians 2, when he talks about the work of Christ bringing us near to him, let me find the reference here. Verse 19.
Okay.
After recounting how Christ has reconciled Jew and Gentile both through the blood of Christ, he says, and he's really speaking to Gentiles here. He says, now therefore you are no more strangers and foreigners. You're no longer aliens. Okay. So it's not just Jews who were brought out of bondage, but the Gentile believers were aliens to the covenants. That's the concept. And so we too, if we're Gentile believers, you know, we were strangers. We have to ethically understand that how we treat the stranger is based, at least in some recognition of there, but by the grace of God go I, right? And
Mm.
it's explicit when you go to passages like Leviticus 19. Um, After, earlier in the passage, it talks about love your neighbor as yourself. And then in verse 34, it says, you shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native,
Mm-hmm.
no differently than your neighbor. You shall love him as yourself. Why? Because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And then last scripture, we get to the judgment parable in Matthew 25, and the parable of God on his throne separating the sheep and the goats, the saved and the lost. And he says about the sheep, those who are to be saved, I was hungry and you gave me nothing. Oh, those are lost. I was hungry, let's see, and you gave me something to eat. You gave me food to eat. I was thirsty.
Mm-hmm.
You gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. You took me in, right?
Yeah.
So throughout the most prominent ethical command in the Torah, in the books of Moses, central to Judaism, 35 times, how we treat the stranger. So how our laws deal with citizenship, we can turn to that, but it's an imperative. And whatever we may think of America as a Christian nation, or not really a Christian nation, but at least a nation with a lot of Christian people who, take biblical ethics seriously, I think that we should be thinking about what
Mm-hmm.
is the ethical and moral way to deal with the immigration issue.
Yeah. Well, and that just, as you were talking, made me think about, some people might be thinking, well, hey, man, you guys are all about separation of church and state, and now here you are pushing biblical values. And I think the distinction that a lot of people miss is one that people like Roger Williams, and go back to like Alonzo T. Jones and Ellen White, these people, they articulated it really well, where it was like, in matters of faith, Christians should not legislate over others. We should not be out there trying to legislate our faith. When it comes to moral and ethical values about social justice, absolutely, you should let your faith influence how you vote. And so, yeah, if you're going to be someone who wants to vote your values, then you ought to vote values that are supported by Scripture, social values that are supported by Scripture. And this is one of them, as you've pointed out, that is explicit and it's frequent in Scripture. This is not some peripheral, thing, or some principle that you have to like extrapolate. This is like over and over and over again: treat the stranger well, etc. So we're coming back to this court case, and you've really laid out a good case as to why we should care about this as followers of Jesus. Let's talk a little bit about the actual issue here. So of course, the starting place is the 14th Amendment. Let me read the 14th Amendment. Okay, this is in the Constitution, and I'm going to read just the first part. I think it's section 1. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So that's the part that we're dealing with in this particular Supreme Court case. And it's pretty clear that there are two ways that you can become a citizen. You can be born here or naturalized, which is a process, and there are laws that deal with how that can happen. But this case is specifically challenging the aspect here that says all persons born in the United States, are citizens thereof. Now, the part that they're using here, the Trump administration is using to challenge this, is the section that says, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And they're arguing that means something that it really has never been interpreted to mean. What's telling to me, Alan, is how, organizations like the Cato Institute that are not liberal, uh, progressive left-leaning groups, they're calling this out and saying this isn't, the right interpretation that the Trump administration is taking. In fact, they have criticized it really well in some things you can read online. So, what do you think? And of course, in oral argument yesterday, it seemed like even the conservative justices were skeptical of the Trump administration's position. What are your thoughts?
So I got to hear quite a bit of the argument. I think enough to get a sense of what the issues are, and of course, I've read various things about it. So let me kind of cut to the chase. Okay. So the text itself puts the emphasis on the place of birth. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It puts the emphasis on the child. The child is born in the United States. It doesn't say anything about the status of their parents.
Right.
It's all about where the child is born. The Solicitor General arguing for the executive order, trying to defend the executive order, he's making arguments about the status of the parents, which is not anything to do with the actual statute, right? One of the first problems I want to point out is he made a big argument about really a policy argument about the problem of birth tourism. And he said, there are like 50 different companies in China that are organized to basically, sell birth tourism. So Chinese parents can come to the United States, have their baby, and then go home. Right. So, the policy questions, of course, are interesting, but that's not the constitutional text.
Right.
Okay. The distinction, he was trying to make was, parents who come here to have their baby, but have no commitment, no allegiance. Allegiance was one of the big, allegiance and domicile were the two big terms. There was a lot of discussion about allegiance and domicile. You don't see anything about allegiance or domicile in the text of the 14th Amendment. It's not about the attitude of the parents. Now, if you think through the logical application of this executive order, kids who were born here of immigrant parents would never have their citizenship be secure, because it could always be attacked at some point. Well, your parents, didn't have adequate allegiance, or they didn't have adequate immigration status, and therefore you're not a citizen. And if they've been living their whole life here, whether they're 5 years old or 35 years old, they don't have another country. They don't have another citizenship. So, what this is proposing to do is to create a large underclass of stateless kids.
Yep.
Right. It's incredibly damaging. So I think, the real divide here is between, this emphasis on concepts that are not in the 14th Amendment, domicile and allegiance. And how do you judge whether somebody intends to be domiciled here or intends to have allegiance?
I'm sure a lot of those parents, who are undocumented would say, sure, I intend to stay here, right? I mean, maybe some of the Chinese tourists wouldn't say that, but a lot of other undocumented parents would. So, yeah. How do you judge that?
There are other countries that have other ways of determining citizenship, but ours derives from the English common law, and it was not it was not part of the language of the 14th Amendment that was hotly debated at the time.
Yeah, and if you go back to 1898, when the United States versus Wong Kim Ark case which really was the one that it's been kind of normative. That's been the case that we've operated under, at least the case law there. The court there said that the status of citizenship is to be fixed by the place of nativity, means birth, irrespective of parentage. So that has been the operative language, the understanding that's been normative ever since then, at least. And if you look back to what was the public understanding in the 1860s when the 14th Amendment was enacted, it was the same then. And it really, what was the historical background as to why the 14th Amendment came into play, or why was it, why did we have the 14th Amendment? Why was it passed anyway?
Well, I mean, both sides share an understanding that the focus was on granting the full rights of citizenship to the newly freed slaves, right?
Yeah. Right.
The women's suffrage movement lost the battle at that time. It took them another 50 years to get the right to vote, right? So black men were given the right to vote, but women were not given the right to vote. And of course, there was a common understanding that this did not apply to the term we used at the time was Indians. We call them Native Americans now. Some have criticized the Supreme Court for the reference to the Indian tribes in their discussion, but that just, I mean, all our efforts to overcome the structural racism of our founding document, it's been a slow go.
A slow go. And it seems like sometimes we take one step forward and three steps back. So not sure where we're at with all that right now. All right. Another issue to talk about today, Alan, is voting and making sure that non-citizens, kind of going back to that citizen issue, don't vote. That this has been a concern by a lot of people, at least on the right. And I would say it seems like most Americans agree that elections should be secure and only citizens should vote, et cetera, right? So let's ask the question first off, is this an actual problem at any scale? If you look at the Heritage Foundation's website, so the Heritage Foundation, of course, they are the authors of Project 2025. You could argue that pretty much, all of the policies we're seeing in the second Trump administration have found their roots to some extent in the Heritage Foundation's, mode of thinking and maybe even in Project 2025, a lot of those policies at least. And on their own website, they have a whole section devoted to election fraud. So if you go look at it, it's fascinating because other groups have done this work, and I've actually looked on there myself, but they found that they, have a very small amount of election fraud cases. And when you look at the actual percentage in relation to the number of people that are voting, it's like minuscule. So the other thing is a lot of these cases that they list there go back decades. So they're not like recent ones either. So it's just fascinating to see that the problem is really not that big of a problem. But I think it's more of this kind of it's a big conspiracy theory out there that illegals are voting in the elections and tipping the elections for whoever, and that's what's really happening. But there's really, courts have not found evidence of that over and over and over again. When I'm thinking about the 2020 election, when the Trump administration went to court, how many times? Like 100 times, and they pretty much lost every case there challenging that election because of supposed voter fraud and things like that. And so I think it's just an interesting thing to talk about. Is this really a problem? The statistics, even those cited by the Heritage Foundation, do not support the idea that this is a big problem at all. Yeah, there is election fraud, but it's very small, very few people here and there. But nonetheless, the GOP is pushing the SAVE Act, as well as the Trump administration recently signed an executive order preserving and protecting the integrity of American elections. So what is What does this executive order claim to do, Ellen?
Well, I want to back up one step. I want to get to your question, but there's a pattern here between these two executive orders, and it is the willingness, the presumption of this administration to simply reject what the Constitution says and does, and to assume to have virtually unlimited power to do what it wants, regardless.
Okay.
What,
So what does
what
the
we didn't
Constitution say
well,
about voting?
what we didn't say in terms of the Birthright executive order is that executive order was a complete slap in the face of the 14th Amendment. Basically was saying, I don't care that the 14th Amendment says if you're born here, you have citizenship. I say differently.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I expect the court to uphold the law in this case.
Constitution.
Although,
yeah.
I don't have a crystal ball, I,
and the track record isn't always that great with this court, but anyway.
So, when it comes to voting, well, the Constitution is very explicit. Congress regulates certain aspects of voting for national elections, for Congress and the presidency, etc. The states have part of our system of federalism, right? There are powers that belong to the states. The states get to regulate their own voting. The president is given absolutely zero authority over voting. For Trump to purport to issue an executive order, all of these things are just kind of distractions, if you will, from actually doing something that matters, that counts, right? To help govern and help the government meet the needs of the people. There's just so many outrageous things, but the theme here that I'm suggesting is the willingness of this administration to simply say, I don't care what the law says, I don't care what the Constitution says, I'm going to say it means what I say it means.
So let's talk about the SAVE Act a little bit. And I think both this and the recent executive order, they have, the goal here is to really regulate, how voting happens and make sure that there's a proof of citizenship for those who are voting, right? So on a,
Steve,
purely...
this is a shell game. It's a game of 3-card Monte, right? Look over here when the real action is over there. And what do I mean by that? Well, all right. There was a time in our history when some of the urban political machines would, urge people to vote early and often, and they'd have dead people voting. We're not immune from voting fraud at the ballot box in our history. But as you pointed out, all of the investigations, all of the studies made left, right, and center show this has not been a problem for a very long time. In our elections are well run. So why do I say it's 3-card Monte? Because if there's a problem, and nobody has been able to demonstrate this conclusively, so we don't know if it is. Just I'm not going to indulge a conspiracy theory here. But if there's a problem, it's not at the ballot box. It's the electronic systems after the ballot box. Okay. So the SAVE Act is an effort to get Congress really illegally to manipulate what happens at the ballot box and who gets to vote and how we get to vote and all of that. And essentially is an effort to restrict voting. That's the bottom line. Because one of the main provisions is in requiring certain kinds of proof of identity. Married women in particular, many married women would be unable to vote because their driver's licenses don't match their birth certificates.
Well, although I have read in more recent permutations of the bill, they have done some updates that would allow some workarounds and that type of thing. So, they may have fixed that issue to some extent. The
All right, but
problem is,
there are millions of people.
yeah,
Number one, if you're going to restrict mail-in voting, there are millions of people who are not, by age or disability, physically going to go vote. Okay, so they don't want those people voting.
What strikes me as interesting about this is that the folks who are pushing this are, again, I think there's this kind of theory that's driving it, that all of these illegal people are voting. Mail-in voting is just, by default, it must be kind of, insecure.
An invitation to fraud.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think they're looking at that. That's their assumption. When in reality, a lot of the people, like even, the supporters of this administration, are voting by mail. Even President Trump himself just recently voted by mail. So it's like people on both sides vote by mail. So I think it's shooting whoever does this, whether it's the right or the left, it's shooting yourself in the foot to do some of these things. And so I wonder if there are going to be some unintended consequences if this actually gets passed.
Voting day is what day of the week?
Tuesday.
Right. It's a Tuesday. It's a work day.
Yeah, that part right there.
So if you're working, there's no requirement that your boss give you the day off.
Right.
If you're working. And then what if you're a single mother, right? You've already been navigating work and childcare. And now you're tired after a long day of work. And now you have to go vote in the evening. It doesn't make it easy. I remember one presidential election. I had a cold. I wasn't feeling well. And my voting district had a 3-hour line. I didn't vote. I could not physically stay on, and the way, and it's very insidious. I don't think most Americans are aware of this, but there are many districts where the way that the voting is, where you're supposed to go vote is designed. It's designed to create long lines to discourage you to vote.
So you sound like a conspiracy theorist, Alan. So you're telling me that there are people who don't want you to vote? Is that what you're saying?
This is not a conspiracy. All you have to do is tune into, right-wing policy, wonks, and they're very clear. They don't want people to vote.
Oh, that is true. There are people on, the far right who say that. So you're saying, though, this is not just, this is pretty mainstream, because what I find to be kind of astounding is that, we don't have, whatever, election day. It's not a holiday in most places. Some states might have it as a holiday. I forget if California does, but
no.
It should be a holiday, number one, I would think, right? If you want participation from more of the population, the citizenry, then we should have it as a holiday, number one. Number two, make it easy for people to register to vote. So here in California, I know that you can simply do it through your DMV, when you basically register a car or something like that. But with the SAVE Act, that would change, and it would make it much more difficult. They'd have to go back. You'd have to go back. You and I would have to go in, show proof of citizenship. So the proof would be a birth certificate or a passport. Now, I think the part that some of us might say, well, I've got a passport, I'm good, I've got my birth certificate. But the reality is that if you don't have those things, and maybe you're not someone who has good transportation, you don't have the money. A passport's expensive. You're talking a couple $100 at least, right? And it takes time. And if you have to have time, know-how, and money, in other words, to do all of this. And so it's going to disenfranchise a sizable part of the population if, we say you have to show a birth certificate or passport. People say, well, it's worth it. Well, my thing is, okay, if you're going to do this, then you need to roll this out over a period of, say, 4 to 8 years. You can't do it all at once, right? That would just not be, essentially fair at all. And I think that's the thing. It becomes almost like a modern poll tax, right? Where you say, if you don't have this passport that's going to cost you almost $200 or whatever, you can't vote. And that to me goes back to what the Constitution actually says in the 24th Amendment is illegal. And that is, poll taxes. So, Ellen, why should we care about this issue? Because otherwise, we're just talking about politics here, and you and I want to be careful not to be partisan. I mean, I think with this issue and others, we can say we're not talking about this because it's a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. We're here to really talk about this because it affects justice for everybody, and how does it affect religious liberty even if people are not able to vote, or it becomes very difficult for some people to vote because they don't have the money, they don't have the know-how. Something is, we got a law now that says you got to have a birth certificate. Maybe you don't have a birth certificate, you don't know how to get one.
Brass tacks, and let's wrap it up here. So the context of all of my study and discussion and advocacy in the last couple of years has been our Seventh-day Adventist understanding of the prophecy of Revelation 13, where the second beast, we believe, beginning in verse 11, represents the United States of America.
Right.
And it has two characteristics. In the prophecy, it has two horns that are lamb-like or Christ-like, and it speaks as a dragon. Okay, those are the two characteristics. Mm-hmm. And our Adventist understanding is that the two horns are the principles of republicanism and Protestantism, which is to say, a system with the separation of powers, a constitutional system that divides power, that protects freedom, that protects our Republican form of government. Mm-hmm. But that Republican form of government, it's also the separation between church and state, the two horns being a symbol of power, right? But that all of those values and principles give way to the dragon. And so what we see in the prophecy, and it's described in more detail as it goes along, is the repudiation not only of the separation of church and state, but of our Republican form of government, of our principles of government. And never before, we've seen the growth of the imperial presidency through administrations, Republican and Democrat both, but we've never seen an administration that simply throws out the Constitution entirely and says, I don't care what the Constitution says. I make the law. I say what the law is, and that is kingly power. And that's what we fought a revolution against. And that constitutes the fulfillment of a prophecy that takes us down a very dark road leading to the mark of the beast, the final round of persecution, etc. Our calling as Seventh-day Adventists is to warn against these kinds of things that destroy our freedoms, that destroy our republic. So the context for all of these discussions is the complete erosion of both our religious freedom side of our commitment to civil liberties and religious liberties, but also the Republican side. And that's a small r. It's not one party or the other. And yeah, for the federal government, for the president to issue an executive order and purport to determine who is a citizen or who is not a citizen, or who gets to vote or not vote, these are usurpations, right? Clearly defined powers that
the Congress gives, that either says explicitly the Constitution says if you're born here, you are a citizen, or it gives that power to the states to regulate the elections largely. Yeah. So That's a good summary, Alan, and a good way to, I think, end our episode today. So thanks for joining us. And this is the Church State Council today.